Jackie Mason turned to the camera. Then he looked at Ed, and he made that gesture. The studio froze. The director in the control booth looked up from his monitors. The cameramen stopped breathing. The audience sat in silence, not quite understanding what they had just witnessed. But Ed Sullivan understood. His face, that famous stone face that had never cracked through 1,000 performances, cracked now, not into anger, into something colder, something permanent. 50 million Americans were watching. A man whose hands had slipped out of control for 2 seconds had in those 2 seconds challenged the most powerful man in the history of American television. 2 seconds. Just 2 seconds. And 20 years of a career turned to ash. Ed Sullivan could make you a star overnight. He could also make you disappear as if you had never existed. If you love the brutal power struggles of television history, subscribe now and join us on our journey to 1,000 subscribers as we open these dark pages of the past together. October 1964, New York City, Studio 50. That autumn evening had started perfectly. The stage lights were warm. The studio was packed. The orchestra was tuned and ready. And Ed Sullivan stood at the center of it all with the quiet authority of a man who had built an empire one Sunday night at a time. 17 years. 17 years of this show. He had put Elvis on that stage. He had introduced the Beatles to America. He had stood in this exact spot and watched careers launch like rockets. Nobody in American entertainment had more power than Ed Sullivan, and nobody in American entertainment knew it better than Ed Sullivan. But in the middle of that night, something happened that Ed had not planned for, something that no amount of preparation or control could have prevented. President Lyndon B. Johnson had gone on television, live, and the speech kept going. In 1964, when the President of the United States interrupted scheduled programming, nobody changed the channel. You watched, you waited. And as Johnson's speech stretched from minutes into more minutes, Ed Sullivan stood in his control booth watching the clock with an expression that nobody on his staff had ever seen before. Not quite fury, not quite panic. Something between the two that had no name. Every minute Johnson spoke was a minute stolen from Ed's program. Blocks shifted. Carefully planned segments collapsed into each other. The elegant machinery that Ed had spent decades building was grinding to a halt because a man in Washington had decided to speak to the nation on a Sunday night. Ed Sullivan hated uncertainty more than anything in the world. He hated improvisation. He hated the unexpected. His show was a precision instrument, and right now someone was driving a truck through it. Jackie Mason was on the program that night, a young, ambitious, sharp-tongued Jewish comedian from the Bronx, who had spent years grinding through clubs and small venues and late-night slots that nobody wanted. He had clawed his way up every step of the ladder, earning each booking through sheer force of personality and a voice that cut through any room like a knife through paper. The Sullivan Show was the summit. This was the night that separated careers that mattered from careers that faded away into the dark. Mason had been ready for weeks. He had rehearsed his material until it was instinct. He knew exactly which words would land, exactly where the pauses should fall, exactly how long to let the laughter breathe before pushing forward. But this was his first time performing for 50 million people at once, and there is nothing in the world that prepares you for that number. He stood in the wings, listening to Johnson's voice from the monitors, watching the clock with the helpless concentration of a man watching an accident. He cannot stop. The minutes were disappearing, his carefully constructed set being compressed by a force he had no power over. And then Ed Sullivan appeared at the edge of the stage. The cameras couldn't reach him there. The audience couldn't see him, but Mason could see him clearly. That tall, stiff figure in the dark suit. That face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than ordinary stone. Ed raised one finger. 1. His eyes found Mason's with the precision of a laser. 1 minute. Mason nodded. He stepped to the microphone. He grabbed it the way a drowning man grabs a rope. He opened his mouth and the comedy began. And for a moment the studio exhaled and the audience leaned forward, and everything was fine. For 30 seconds, everything was fine. Then Ed was back at the stage edge. This time 2 fingers held up in the dim light beyond the spotlight's reach. 2 minutes left. Meaning wrap it up. Meaning pull yourself together. Meaning this is my show, my time, my stage, and you will finish when I tell you to finish. Mason glanced at the fingers. He smiled at the audience as if sharing a private joke. He kept going. The expression on Ed Sullivan's face changed in a way that people who knew him best described later as frightening. It didn't explode into anger. It went still, completely still. This was a man who had spent nearly 2 decades watching performers test limits, watching them push back, watching them decide in the moment that their instincts mattered more than his instructions. He had seen it 100 times. He always remembered, and he always made sure they remembered too. Then Johnson's speech ended. The broadcast returned to regular programming. The director in the control booth switched back to Studio 50 and looked at Ed with a single silent question written across his face. Ed walked to the stage edge one final time. He raised one finger. The message required no translation. Finish. Now. Not in 30 seconds. Not at a natural stopping point in the material. Now. Mason looked at the camera. He looked at the audience. He looked at the stage edge where Ed Sullivan stood in the shadows with that single finger raised. And his hands moved. Exactly what happened in that moment has been debated for 6 decades. Mason told the same story every time anyone asked him about it for the rest of his life. I was waving my hands. That is what I do when I perform. My hands are always moving. I had no idea which finger was up or which finger was down. I was on stage, I was in the middle of a bit. I was pointing at something or gesturing at something, the way I always do. There was no intention. There was no message. There was nothing. But Ed Sullivan knew exactly what he had seen. Or at least he knew exactly what he was going to say. He had seen. Because in that moment, with his schedule destroyed and his authority ignored, and a young comedian from the Bronx refusing to stop when instructed to stop, the gesture became the explanation for everything. The proof of disrespect that had been building since the first time Mason smiled and kept going. The middle finger, on live television, in front of 50 million people, directed at him, at Ed Sullivan. The backstage dressing rooms became a courtroom that night, and the verdict had already been decided before the door clicked shut. Ed Sullivan walked in with the controlled fury of a man who had been waiting his entire career to make exactly this point to exactly this kind of person. His palm came flat on the table. The sound was sharp and final in the small room. Everyone saw it. The cameras saw it. America saw it. In my studio, on my program, in front of my audience, you gave me the finger. Mason's hand spread wide. His voice didn't want to rise but rose anyway, cracking slightly at the edges with something between protest and desperation. Ed, I swear to you. I was pointing. I was indicating the time. I didn't mean anything by it. There was nothing there. Nothing. The word came out of Ed's mouth the way a door shuts in winter. Hard and cold and with a finality that sealed everything behind it. Everyone saw it. Jackie. Everyone. There were others in the room. Producers, assistants, a stage manager leaning against the far wall. Not one of them spoke. They all understood that this was no longer a conversation that could be joined or redirected or softened. This was a sentencing. They were witnesses, not participants. Ed Sullivan looked at Jackie Mason with the expression of a judge who has already written the verdict and is reading it aloud as a formality, not for the defendant's benefit but for the record. You're finished, he said. The voice was quiet now, almost conversational, which made it worse. On this program, on this network, in this industry, finished. Mason walked out of Studio 50 that night, with his material having landed, his audience having laughed, the performance technically successful by every measure that should have mattered. But as he passed through the stage door into the cold October air of West 53rd Street, something had already changed in a way he could feel but not yet fully understand. He could sense it the way you sense a change in weather before the first drop of rain falls. Everything looked the same. Nothing was the same. The calls started that week. Or rather, the calls stopped. Appointments that had seemed solid went soft and then disappeared entirely. Managers who had been enthusiastic became suddenly unavailable. Las Vegas venues that had been in serious discussions went cold without explanation. Television bookers who had expressed genuine interest developed other priorities that could not be discussed. The entertainment industry is a small world, and small worlds have excellent informal communication. The message had traveled faster than Mason could track it, faster than he could respond to it, faster than any denial or explanation or lawsuit could follow. Jackie Mason was blacklisted. Not officially. There was no document signed, no meeting held, no formal decree. There did not need to be. Ed Sullivan's displeasure was a currency that everyone in American entertainment understood. Associating with Mason meant carrying whatever risk Mason now represented. And nobody in a business built on relationships wanted to carry that risk. Then came the lawsuit. Ed Sullivan filed for $45,000 in damages, claiming defamation and professional harm. In 1964 dollars, that number was staggering. The legal language was precise and devastating. Sullivan alleged that Mason had deliberately made an obscene gesture on live national television, with full awareness of its meaning, causing measurable damage to Sullivan's professional reputation and the standing of his program. The lawsuit was not about damages. It was a public declaration addressed to every booking agent, every television producer, every club owner and promoter in the American entertainment industry. The declaration said, "This is what happens. You get on Ed Sullivan's stage and you do not do exactly what Ed Sullivan requires. This is the cost. You do not simply lose a booking, you lose everything." For 20 years Mason paid that cost. He kept working because stopping would have meant a different kind of death. But the rooms grew smaller. The audiences grew thinner. The Manhattan clubs that had been his launchpad became his permanent address. He traveled to cities the major circuits had forgotten, performed for audiences who appreciated his talent but had no power to change his situation. He spent 20 years being genuinely, undeniably funny in rooms where being funny was not enough. A generation of television viewers grew up without ever encountering Jackie Mason. His name surfaced occasionally in conversations among older comedians who mentioned him as a reference or a cautionary tale. But on the screens where American comedy built its careers and defined its culture, he simply did not exist. He had been edited out of the story. Ed Sullivan died in October 1974, exactly 10 years after the incident that had defined Mason's career. The blacklist did not dissolve immediately with him. The culture he had built, the instinctive understanding that certain names carried certain associations, the reflexive avoidance of anything that might recall an old displeasure, these things outlasted the men who had created them. They dissolved slowly, the way all institutional memories dissolve, year by year as the people who held them moved on. By the mid-1980s, the landscape had genuinely changed. Mason began appearing in better venues, then in rooms that mattered, then on stages that changed things. In 1987, he opened a one-man Broadway show called The World According to Me. Critics, who had arrived prepared for a nostalgic curiosity, found themselves writing reviews that reached for words like masterful and essential and overdue. The Tony Award Committee offered their recognition. Audiences who had never heard of Jackie Mason saw the show and called their friends, and their friends called their friends, and the production ran and ran until it had become one of the defining comedic events of the decade. America had found Jackie Mason. The question that followed him everywhere in that period was always the same. Where had he been? Why had it taken this long? How had talent this obvious been absent from the major stages for 2 decades? Mason spoke about the Sullivan incident with more openness in his later years than he had when the memory was still raw and the consequences still felt. "Ed Sullivan buried me for 20 years over one moment," he said. "One gesture, 1 second of one performance. I spent 20 years paying for something I still do not fully understand. I was on stage doing my job. My hands were moving the way hands move when you perform. But Ed saw something he decided to see, and once Ed Sullivan decided something, the conversation was over before it began." Studio 50 still stands at Broadway and 53rd Street, now called the Ed Sullivan Theater, home for decades to The Late Show. Different programs, different hosts, different cameras and lighting rigs and production values, but the same stage. The same wings where Ed Sullivan once stood in the half-dark with his arms crossed and his judgment already formed, watching a young comedian from the Bronx make the decision that would define both their legacies. 2 seconds, one hand gesture, 20 years, The question has never been settled and almost certainly never will be. Did Jackie Mason deliberately give Ed Sullivan the finger on live national television in front of 50 million people? Or did Ed Sullivan, in a moment when his authority had been ignored and his schedule had been destroyed, see in an ambiguous gesture exactly what he needed to see, and use that moment to send a message that the entire industry would understand and remember for a generation? Can a misunderstanding destroy a life? Or was Ed Sullivan simply protecting the one thing he had spent 17 years building and would spend the rest of his career defending? The absolute certainty that on his stage, in his studio, during his program, his word was the final word on everything. Let us know what you think in the comments below.